Hi, kindergarteners. Today, I'm going to be reading you a story from a brand new unit for listening and learning called Colonial Towns and Townspeople. As a quick introduction to the new unit, you learned about places and people long ago when you heard stories about Native Americans, kings and queens, and Christopher Columbus. Today, we will start learning about colonial towns and the people who lived there. Have you ever wondered what America was like hundreds of years ago? Back in the colonial times, people lived very differently. There was no television, no computers, and no electricity. Life for kids was very different too. Kids helped their parents do chores. You will see that their toys and their clothes were different too. Are you excited to see what life was like hundreds of years ago? Let's begin. Lesson 1, the country family. Today, we're going to take an imaginary trip back in time, about 300 years ago, to an early American farm. If you lived in the country long ago, you and your family did most of the work necessary for survival right at home. In the country, houses were far apart from one another, so you couldn't rely on neighbors or stores to get everything you needed. You had to make the most of things at home. Everything you needed, food to eat, water to drink, or use for cooking and cleaning, lighting to help you see after dark, heat when it turned cold, and clothing, required a lot of work by the family. Even young children had to help out because there was so much work to do. There was no electricity for lamps or lights, and there were no flashlights. The only way to see anything after it got dark was to light candles that you made at home. There were no electric ovens or stoves, so you had to build a fire to heat your home and cook your meals. There were no sinks or faucets with running water inside the house, so you had to fetch any water you needed for drinking, cooking, or cleaning from the nearby creek or the well outside. There were no malls with clothing stores, so you had to make your own clothes. There were no supermarkets, so you had to grow your own vegetables, milk your own cows, and make your own cheese. Imagine doing all of that work every day. What was like life in colonial times? Life was really different. If I need clothes or food, I go to a store to get what I need, or I can even buy things on my computer. Back then in colonial times, people had to do all of that on their own. They had to make their own things, or they had to use animals on their farm to get what they needed. A typical day in the country, the first thing a woman did was fetch wood to start the fire in the hearth or fireplace. The hearth was the most important place in the home. Most of the chores to be done required fire. Especially in the winter, everyone needed to stay close to the hearth because it provided the only heat in the house. Imagine if the only way to stay warm in your house was to sit right next to the fireplace. It does happen sometimes, but that was the only way they could get heat. After building the fire, a country woman would most likely start her day by baking bread. Sometimes she would make her own flour by grinding corn kettles or wheat into a fine powder. Then she would mix this flour and water with yeast and let it rise for several hours. The dough would then be put in an iron pot with a tight lid and hung over the hearth to bake or cook. Does the picture up here look like your home? It definitely looks different from mine. I don't have a fireplace at my house, so that's really different than my home. Also, imagine if every single day you had to start by baking bread. Imagine if you got to school or you woke up in the morning and the first thing happening was all of the women were making bread for the family. That would be so crazy. One task that had to be done twice a day, no matter what, was milking the cows. This task took a long time and was usually left for the children to do. Once the milk was collected, the milk that was not used was either made into cheese or butter. Making cheese involved a slow process of boiling and cooling the milk to produce curds or clumps of soured milk that look sort of like cottage cheese. These curds were pressed into forms to make cheese. To make butter, milk was left to sit until the fatty cream floated to the top. Then the cream was poured into a tall wooden container called a churn. There's a picture of a churn right there. A child usually had to pump the handle of the butter churn, called the dasher, up and down for a long time until the fat and the cream separated into butter. The leftover liquid called buttermilk would be used for cooking or drinking. So in order to have any butter, the kids had to grab that stick that you see, and they had to slam it up and down for a long time until the gooey milk stuff turned into hard butter. I wonder, do you think it's hard to make your own butter? I think that would be really hard. I'm glad that when I need butter, I can just go to the store and buy some, because I would not want to make butter every single day. People in the country ate mostly vegetables and grains. They only ate meat if the men or nearby neighbors had butchered one of their animals. Because there were no refrigerators, the meat had to be preserved so it would not spoil. This was done by hanging it in strips above the fire or in a separate shed like the one called the smokehouse. So if you look at that picture on the side, that little house, that's where they would keep them. The smoke from the fire dried out the meat, which prevented it from spoiling. Other foods were preserved by covering them in salt, canning them, or storing them in a cool, dark cellar. Canning is a way of preserving food. So right below me, you see this little can of pineapple slices. That's a way to keep them so that they don't get rotten or spoiled. And you can keep cans like the one in this picture. You could keep those for a really long time, like a year, and they would never go bad. I wonder, do you have any cans of food at your house? Next time you're in your kitchen, you could ask someone in your family if you have any cans, and you can see how that's a way to keep your food fresh and so that you can eat it for a long time. After all the chores were done, it was time for the sewing. In colonial times, women had to make their own thread and cloth before they could sew anything. Men and boys picked cotton from the fields or sheared the sheep, and women cleaned and dyed this cotton or wool. Then women made the cotton or wool into thread or yarn. After that, they would weave the yarn into cloth to be used for clothing. Girls were taught to sew and weave, usually before the age of 10, so that they could help make their own clothes. Because it was so much work to make clothes and so expensive to buy new clothes in town, much of the sewing work was patching or fixing old clothes that had become worn out and had holes or tears. Imagine if you had to make all of your own clothes, even when you were a kid. It says in the story that girls had to make clothes before they were even 10 years old. Imagine if you wanted a new shirt and you had to go and get all the cotton, and you had to dye it the color you wanted, and then you had to sew it all. It would probably take a year to make one thing. I'm really glad that today we can just go to a store or go on the computer and buy the clothes or the things that we want. Because children were expected to help out with every one of these chores, they did not have a lot of time to play. Sometimes girls made dolls like these out of the parts of a corn plant. Sometimes boys carved small toys out of wood. The country family in colonial times worked hard every day. Sometimes a trip into town was a welcome relief or break from their daily tasks. In town, the family was able to trade or buy things they needed so they could save the time and effort it took to make them. So it sounds like if there was something that they couldn't make themselves, there was a town that they could go to buy things, but the town was probably really far away. So they probably didn't go there a lot. I wonder, would you want to live in these colonial times? Imagine if the only toys you could play with were these dolls made out of corn, or if you had to do chores all day and not even have time to play. I don't know. Let's talk about a few questions after our story. You know that good listeners and good readers always go back and are able to answer questions that they can find right in the story. So in colonial times, what kinds of chores did children who lived on the farm have to do? Well, I remember from the story that the kids had to milk the cows. They also had to churn butter. They had to sew their own clothes, and they had to make their own toys. Was the farm we heard about in today's story a farm that existed a long time ago or one that's today? Remember, When we're learning about the colonial times, this all happened a long time ago. Long ago, there was no electricity. What did farmers use for light to see at night? If you remember from the story, they had to make their own candles, and that was the way that they could see at night. Long ago, there were no furnaces to heat the houses. What did people use to warm their houses? Well, if you look back in the story, to warm their houses, people would sit in front of the fireplace or the hearth, and that was the only way that they could get warmth. Do you think you would have liked living on a farm in the country hundreds of years ago? Well, everyone might have a different answer for this. I think that it would be kind of cool to see what life was like on the farm a long time ago, but I also really like that I don't have to make all my own clothes and make all of my own toys and make all of my own food. So I don't know how much I would really like to live on the farm long ago. The next time we read together, you'll hear about what happened when a farmer took a trip into town. So in today's story, it said that they would go to the town for special things. So we're going to see in the next story what the town is like and what the people do there. Thank you all for reading with me today, and I can't wait for the next time that we get to read together. Bye.